James pulled into the driveway of his childhood home, tired from the long drive back from college. Summer break had arrived sooner than expected after his final exams finished early. He hadn't told his father he was coming home today, wanting to surprise him. His dad had remarried while James was away at school, and though they had spoken on the phone, James had yet to meet his new stepmom in person. The house looked different somehow. New flower beds lined the walkway, and the old porch swing had been replaced with a modern bench. James grabbed his backpack from the passenger seat and headed to the front door. He tried his key, but it didn't work. Of course, his dad must have changed the locks after getting married. James rang the doorbell and waited. He heard footsteps approaching, and the door swung open. Standing before him was a woman with warm brown eyes and a welcoming smile. She looked nothing like what James had imagined. His father had described her as elegant and sophisticated, but failed to mention how young she was, probably only 10 years older than James himself. "You must be James," she said, her voice soft and pleasant. "I'm Lisa. Your father didn't mention you were coming home today." "I wanted to surprise him," James replied, suddenly feeling awkward. "My exams finished early." Lisa stepped aside to let him in. "Your father is still at work. He usually doesn't get home until 6 these days." James walked into the familiar living room, now decorated with new furniture and artwork that gave it a completely different feel. He set his backpack down and looked around, trying to find traces of his childhood home in this new space. "I've heard so much about you," Lisa said, breaking the silence. "Your father is incredibly proud of you." James nodded, unsure what to say. "The house looks different." "I hope you don't mind the changes," Lisa replied, a hint of worry in her voice. "Your father said it was time for a fresh start." "It's nice," James said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "Just different." Lisa showed him to his old bedroom, which thankfully remained mostly untouched. "I insisted we keep your room the same," she explained. "I thought you'd want your own space when you came home." James appreciated the gesture. At least one part of the house still felt like his. "Are you hungry?" "I was just about to make lunch," Lisa offered. "Sure, thanks," James replied, following her to the kitchen. As Lisa prepared sandwiches, James observed her. She moved with grace around the kitchen, seemingly comfortable in her role as his stepmom despite the small age gap between them. He had expected to dislike her on principle, the woman who had taken his mother's place, but found himself warming to her genuine manner. They ate lunch together, the conversation starting awkwardly but gradually becoming more natural. Lisa asked about his studies, genuinely interested in his answers. She didn't try to act motherly or force a connection, which James appreciated. After lunch, James decided to unpack while Lisa went to work on some project she mentioned was in the garage. James couldn't remember the last time anyone had used the garage for anything other than storage. His father had never been particularly handy. Later that afternoon, curious about what Lisa was doing, James wandered out to the garage. He could hear soft music playing as he approached. The side door was slightly ajar, and James peered in. Lisa was bent over what appeared to be an old car engine, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, hands covered in grease. This elegant woman his father had described was elbow-deep in mechanical parts, completely focused on her task. She must have sensed his presence because she looked up suddenly, catching him watching her. Instead of being embarrassed, she smiled. "Do you know anything about engines?" she asked. "A little," James admitted. "What are you working on?" "It's a surprise for your father," she explained, wiping her hands on a rag. "His birthday is next month. I've been restoring this old Mustang for him." James stepped fully into the garage, intrigued. "My dad never mentioned you were into cars." Lisa laughed, a sound that was surprisingly pleasant. "There's a lot your father doesn't know about me yet." She paused, then added, "There's a lot we don't know about each other." "I'm glad you're home, James. I've been hoping we could become friends." The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. James felt the tension he'd been carrying begin to dissolve. Maybe this summer wouldn't be so bad after all. Over the next week, James found himself spending more time with Lisa than he had expected. His father worked long hours at the office, often coming home late and leaving early. James had hoped to reconnect with his dad during summer break, but it seemed work remained his father's priority, even with a new wife at home. On Friday morning, James wandered into the kitchen to find Lisa looking through job listings on her laptop. She glanced up when he entered. "Looking for something?" she asked, closing the screen slightly. "No," James replied, pouring himself some coffee. "Just wondering what you're up to." Lisa smiled. "Actually, I was looking at some summer job openings for you. Your father mentioned you might want to work during break." James was surprised. "That's thoughtful of you." "I found a few that might interest you," Lisa said, turning a laptop toward him. "There's one at an auto shop downtown. Since you mentioned you know a bit about cars, I thought it might be a good fit." James scrolled through the listing. The shop specialized in classic car restoration, something he had always been interested in but never had the chance to pursue. "This looks perfect, actually. Thanks." "I know the owner," Lisa said. "I could put in a good word for you if you'd like." James applied for the job that day and was hired the following Monday. When he returned home after his first day, grease-stained and tired but satisfied, he found Lisa in the garage working on the Mustang. "How was your first day?" she asked, not looking up from the carburetor she was cleaning. "Good," James said, moving closer to see what she was doing. "Better than I expected." "Learn anything new?" "A few tricks about timing belts." James watched her hands work with confidence. "You seem to know what you're doing with that." Lisa laughed. "I grew up with 3 brothers who were always fixing something. I learned by watching them." She pushed her hair from her face with her forearm, leaving a smudge of grease on her cheek. "My dad owned a shop similar to the one you're working at now." Without thinking, James reached out and wiped the grease from her face. Lisa froze at his touch, and for a moment they just looked at each other. James pulled his hand back quickly. "Sorry," he mumbled. "You had grease on your face." Lisa's smile returned, though something in her eyes had changed. "Thanks. Happens all the time." She returned to her work, and James offered to help. Together, they spent the evening working on the engine, talking about cars, college, and their shared love of classic rock music. James was surprised to learn Lisa had attended the same college he now went to, though years earlier. As days turned into weeks, James found himself rushing home from work to spend evenings in the garage with Lisa. The car restoration project became their shared secret, something his father knew about but showed little interest in. Each night they would work until late, talking about everything and nothing as their hands stayed busy with tools and parts. One evening, as they were installing the newly rebuilt engine, James's father called to say he would be working late again. Lisa tried to hide her disappointment, but James could see it in her eyes. "Does he always work this much?" James asked carefully. Lisa nodded. "It's been this way since we got married. I thought it might change, but..." She trailed off, focusing intently on tightening a bolt. "Is that why you started this project? To have something to do while he's away?" She paused, considering his question. "Partly. I also thought it might interest him, give us something to bond over." She laughed softly. "Though I'm beginning to think he'd rather look at it than drive it." James found himself moving closer to her, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice. "His loss," he said. "I think what you're doing is amazing." Lisa looked up at him, their faces inches apart in the dim light of the garage. For a moment, James thought he saw something in her expression, a flicker of connection that went beyond their new family relationship. His heart raced as her eyes met his. The moment was broken by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. His father was home early after all. Lisa stepped back quickly, returning to her work with forced casualness. "We should finish up for tonight," she said, her voice slightly higher than normal. "I'll make dinner." As they cleaned up their tools, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them, that in that brief moment they had both recognized a connection neither had expected to find. The summer heat intensified as June turned to July. James's father announced he would be traveling for business more frequently in the coming weeks, leaving James and Lisa alone in the house for extended periods. The first night after his father left for a 3-day trip to Chicago, James found himself unable to sleep. The house felt different somehow, more intimate without his father's presence. Around midnight, he wandered downstairs for a glass of water and noticed light spilling from beneath the garage door. He pushed it open to find Lisa working on the Mustang, music playing softly from an old radio. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked without looking up. "Not really," James admitted, leaning against the workbench. Thought I heard something out here. Lisa straightened up, stretching her back. I do my best work at night. Always have. She wiped her hands on a rag and reached for a bottle of water. Want to help? I'm trying to get the interior panels fitted. James nodded, and soon they were working side by side in comfortable silence. The night air was thick with humidity, making the garage feel smaller, more intimate. They worked until nearly 3 in the morning, taking breaks only to share stories about their lives before they had met. Lisa told James about growing up in a small town, her dreams of traveling the world, and how she had settled instead for a practical life that had eventually led her to his father. James shared his college experiences, his uncertainty about his future, and memories of his mother that he had never told anyone before. She would have liked you, James said softly, surprising himself with the admission. Lisa looked up, her eyes glistening slightly in the dim light. That means a lot, coming from you. Their late-night work sessions became a routine during his father's absences. Sometimes they would work on the car, other times they would just talk, sharing a bottle of wine as they sat on the old couch James had helped move into the garage. It felt like a world apart from the rest of the house, a place where they could be themselves without the complications of their awkward family situation. One particularly hot night in mid-July, the air conditioning broke down. The house became unbearably stuffy, and they retreated to the garage, where an old fan provided the only relief from the heat. Lisa wore a thin tank top and shorts, her hair piled messily on top of her head. James tried not to notice how the fabric clung to her skin or how gracefully she moved as she worked. Can you hold this steady? She asked, gesturing to a door panel they were trying to install. James moved closer, his arm brushing against hers as he held the panel in place. The brief contact sent a jolt through him that he tried desperately to ignore. Lisa seemed to notice, her movements becoming slightly more deliberate, more careful to maintain distance between them. As the night wore on and the temperature remained oppressive, Lisa suggested they take a break. There's a creek behind the property, she said. Your dad mentioned it once, but we've never gone there. Is it nice? It was my favorite spot growing up, James replied. It should be cooler there. Without discussing it further, they walked through the backyard in the moonlight, following the narrow path to the creek. The water glistened silver in the darkness, the sound of it running over rocks a welcome break from the mechanical noises of the garage. Lisa sat on a large flat rock at the water's edge, dipping her feet into the cool current. James joined her, careful to keep space between them. Tell me something you've never told anyone, she said suddenly, her voice almost a whisper. James thought for a moment. I sometimes wish I could just drive away and never look back. Just get in a car and see where the road takes me. Lisa turned to look at him, her expression serious. What's stopping you? Responsibility, expectations, fear, maybe. I understand that more than you know, she said, her voice tinged with emotion. Before I met your father, I almost did exactly that. Had my bags packed and everything. Why didn't you? Lisa sighed, looking back at the water. The same reasons, I guess. It seemed safer to follow the expected path. James found himself moving closer to her on the rock, drawn by the sadness in her voice. Do you regret it, marrying my dad? The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and impossible to take back. Lisa was quiet for so long that James thought she might not answer. I don't know anymore, she finally whispered. Your father is a good man, but what? James asked, his heart racing. Lisa looked at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. But I'm beginning to wonder if I made the wrong choice for the right reasons. James's father extended his business trip by another week, calling with apologies and promises to make it up to Lisa when he returned. After that night by the creek, something had shifted between James and Lisa. They continued working on the car together, but there was a new tension in the air, a heightened awareness of each other's presence that made ordinary moments feel charged with meaning. One evening, as James reached for a wrench, his hand accidentally brushed against Lisa's. Instead of pulling away quickly as they had both been doing, Lisa let her hand linger against his for a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. I'm sorry, he said, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. Don't be, Lisa replied softly, turning back to the engine. Later that night, after they had finished working, Lisa suggested they watch a movie in the living room. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, but as the night wore on, the distance between them gradually decreased until their shoulders were almost touching. "I never asked how you met my dad," James said during a quiet moment in the film. Lisa tensed slightly. "At a charity event. I was working for the catering company, and he was a guest. He asked for my number afterward." Was it love at first sight? James didn't know why he was torturing himself with these questions. Lisa was quiet for a moment. "No," she finally said. "It wasn't. He was kind and stable, and I was at a point in my life where that seemed more important than." She trailed off. "Then what?" "Then passion," she whispered, still staring at the screen. "Then that feeling that makes your heart race when someone walks into a room." James swallowed hard, and now? Lisa turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Now I'm not so sure." The air between them felt electric, dangerous. The next day, James's boss asked him to stay late at the auto shop to help with an emergency restoration job. He texted Lisa to let her know he wouldn't be home for dinner. When he finally arrived home around midnight, the house was dark except for the light in the garage. He found Lisa underneath the Mustang, struggling with a stubborn bolt. She slid out when she heard him enter, her face streaked with grease, hair falling from its ponytail. "You're home," she said, smiling up at him. Something about seeing her there, dedicated to her project even at this late hour, made James's heart swell. "Need some help?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Always," she replied, their eyes meeting in a way that suggested she might not just be talking about the car. They worked side by side, their bodies occasionally brushing against each other in the confined space. The radio played softly in the background, a slow song that made the atmosphere feel even more intimate. "Dance with me?" Lisa said suddenly, standing and holding out her hand. James hesitated. "In the garage?" "Why not?" she laughed. "No one's watching." He took her hand and she pulled him to the open space in the center of the garage. His hands found her waist as hers rested on his shoulders. They swayed slowly to the music, bodies not quite touching but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. "I never thought this summer would turn out like this," James admitted, his voice low. "Like what?" Lisa asked, though her eyes suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "Finding someone who understands me better than anyone else," he said carefully, "even if it's complicated." Lisa's fingers moved slightly against the back of his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. Complicated is one way to put it. As the song ended, neither of them moved apart. James looked down at her, taking in every detail of her face, the slight crease between her eyebrows, the curve of her lips, the question in her eyes. "Lisa," he began, not sure what he was going to say but knowing he needed to say something. The barrage door suddenly began to open, the mechanical whirring breaking the moment between them. They jumped apart as headlights illuminated the space. James's father's car pulled into the driveway. "He's home early," Lisa whispered, her voice a mixture of surprise and something that sounded like regret. They stood awkwardly apart as James's father entered the garage, his face lighting up at the sight of the nearly completed Mustang. "What a surprise," he exclaimed, completely missing the tension in the air. "You two have been busy while I was gone." James caught Lisa's eye across the garage. The moment between them had passed, but the feeling lingered, unspoken and undeniable. Whatever was happening between them, it had just become even more complicated. James's father stayed home for 3 days, his presence creating a strange barrier between James and Lisa. They were careful around each other, avoiding eye contact, keeping their conversations brief and impersonal. The garage, once their private sanctuary, became just another room in the house, with his father coming in occasionally to admire the progress on the Mustang. On the 4th day, his father announced another business trip, this time to Seattle for a week-long conference. "I hate to leave again so soon," he told Lisa over breakfast, while James pretended to be absorbed in his phone. "But this could mean a promotion." "It's fine," Lisa said, her voice neutral. "We understand." After his father left, the house fell into an uncomfortable silence. James went to work at the auto shop, and Lisa busied herself with household tasks. That evening, dark clouds gathered on the horizon as James drove home. The first drops of rain began to fall as he pulled into the driveway. By nightfall, the storm had intensified. Thunder crashed overhead as rain pounded against the windows. James sat in his room, trying to read but unable to focus. Around 10 o'clock, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, James heard a crash from the direction of the garage. Grabbing his phone for light, he hurried downstairs. He found Lisa in the garage, illuminated by a small battery-powered lantern, picking up tools that had fallen from a shelf. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing to help her. "Just startled," she replied. "I was checking to make sure the windows were closed when everything went dark." The rain drummed on the garage roof as they collected the scattered tools. When they finished, Lisa sat on the old couch, the lantern casting shadows across her face. James hesitated before joining her, leaving space between them. "Some storm," he said, for lack of anything better. Lisa nodded, staring at the partially restored Mustang. "Your father called. The storm has grounded his connecting flight. He's staying in Chicago tonight." They sat in silence, listening to the rain. The darkness and the storm seemed to isolate them from the outside world, creating a bubble where normal rules felt suspended. "Why did you marry him?" James finally asked, the question he had been holding back for weeks. Lisa didn't seem surprised by his directness. "I thought he could give me stability. After years of struggling on my own, that seemed like enough." She turned to face James. "I was wrong. Does he make you happy?" James's heart pounded as he waited for her answer. "No," Lisa whispered. "Not for a long time." "What would make you happy?" Lisa looked at him, her eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. "The possibility of something real. Something that feels like this." The air between them seemed to vibrate with tension. James moved closer to her on the couch, drawn by a force he couldn't resist any longer. "It's wrong," he said softly, even as he reached for her hand. "I know," Lisa replied, but she didn't pull away. "I've tried to ignore it, James. I've tried to see you as my stepson, as just my husband's son, but..." "But what?" "But from the moment I saw you, something felt different. Something I've never felt before, not with your father, not with anyone." James touched her face gently, his fingertips tracing her cheekbone. "I fell for you that first day in the garage, watching you work on this car, seeing who you really are." Lisa leaned into his touch. "We can't do this to him." "I know," James agreed, even as he moved closer. "But I don't know how to stop feeling this way." In the darkness of the garage with the storm raging outside, she finally closed the distance between them. Their lips met tentatively at first. Then with increasing urgency, James pulled her closer, years of loneliness and misunderstanding dissolving in the warmth of her embrace. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Lisa rested her forehead against his. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. James held her close, not knowing the answer but certain of one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following their kiss in the garage were filled with conflicted emotions. When they passed each other in the hallway, their fingers would brush deliberately, sending electricity through James's body. At night, they would talk for hours in the garage, sometimes working on the car, sometimes just sitting close together on the old couch, discussing their impossible situation. "We need to stop this," Lisa said one evening, even as she rested her head on James's shoulder. "Your father doesn't deserve this." "I know," James agreed, his arm around her waist. "But I can't pretend these feelings don't exist." Lisa turned to face him. "I've been married less than a year, and I'm falling for my husband's son. What does that make me?" "Human," James replied softly. "Someone who made a mistake and is brave enough to admit it." They tried to maintain distance when his father called, speaking casually about the Mustang's progress, careful not to betray the tension in their voices. Each night after these calls, they found themselves drawn back together, guilt and desire waging war within them. One night, a week after the storm, Lisa came to the garage with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something," she said, sitting beside James on the couch. "Your father called earlier. He's been offered a position overseas, a 2-year assignment in Singapore." James felt his stomach drop, "And he wants you to go with him." Lisa nodded. "He asked me to think about it while he finishes this trip." She took James's hand. "Before any of this happened between us, I was already having doubts about our marriage. I married him for the wrong reasons, and I think he knows that too." "What do you mean?" "Last month, before you came home, I found divorce papers in his office drawer." Lisa's voice was steady but sad. "They weren't filled out, just printed forms. I think he's been considering it for a while." James processed this information, so he might be using this overseas position as a fresh start, with or without you. Exactly, Lisa said. But now there's you and everything is so much more complicated. They sat in silence, the reality of their situation weighing heavily on them. If there was no moral dilemma, no complication, James finally asked, "What would you want?" Lisa looked at him, her eyes clear and certain. "I'd want to be with you. To see where this could go without the shadow of guilt hanging over us." James took her hands in his. "Then that's what matters. The rest is just circumstances." The next day, James came home from work to find his father's car in the driveway. He had returned early again, without warning. James steeled himself before entering the house, unsure what to expect. He found his father and Lisa sitting at the kitchen table, an uncomfortable silence between them. His father looked up as he entered. "James," he said, his voice formal. "Good timing. We need to talk." For a terrifying moment, James thought they had been discovered, but his father's next words surprised him. "I've accepted a position in Singapore. I'll be leaving next month." He glanced at Lisa, "And I'll be going alone." Lisa's expression was unreadable. "Your father and I have been discussing our situation," she explained carefully. "We've decided to separate." James tried to hide his shock, looking between them. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling hollow. His father sighed. "It's been coming for a while. We married too quickly without really knowing each other." He gave Lisa a sad smile. "We want different things." The conversation continued, his father explaining practical matters about the house and finances. Lisa would stay in the house for now. His father had already arranged to rent an apartment closer to his office until his departure. When his father finally left to get some things from his study, James and Lisa were alone in the kitchen. They couldn't speak freely, but their eyes communicated volumes. "I didn't tell them about us," Lisa whispered. This decision was already made. James nodded, relief and guilt and hope all mingling together. "What happens now?" he asked softly. Lisa glanced toward the study where his father was gathering papers. "One step at a time," she said. "We need to do this right." The weeks that followed were strange and tense. James's father moved out gradually, packing his belongings in stages and staying at his new apartment most nights. He remained surprisingly cordial, explaining to James that the marriage had been a mistake from the beginning, two people seeking comfort rather than love. "Sometimes we make decisions for the wrong reasons," his father told him one evening as they packed books from the study. "The important thing is recognizing it before too much damage is done." James couldn't help but feel a twist of guilt, even as he nodded in agreement. He and Lisa maintained a careful distance whenever his father was around, playing the roles of polite stepmother and stepson, but in the evenings after his father left, they would find themselves gravitating toward the garage, toward each other. The Mustang was nearly finished. What had begun as Lisa's project to connect with her husband had become something else entirely, a symbol of her unexpected bond with James. They worked on it together each night, both knowing that its completion would mark the beginning of something new for them. On a warm August evening, a month after his father had announced the separation, James came home to find Lisa in the garage. The Mustang gleamed under the overhead lights, fully restored to its classic beauty. She stood beside it, keys in hand, smiling nervously. "It's done," she said simply. James walked around the car, admiring the perfect restoration. "It's beautiful," he said. "Dad would have loved it." "I thought we could take it for a test drive," Lisa suggested. "The divorce papers were finalized yesterday. Your father and I met with the lawyers in the morning." James looked at her surprised. "That was fast." "Your father wanted it settled before he leaves for Singapore next week. It was amicable. We both wanted the same thing, freedom to move on." She held out the keys to him. James took them, his fingers lingering against hers. "Where should we go?" he asked. "Anywhere," she replied. "Just drive." The Mustang's engine roared to life, its sound perfect after all their months of work. They drove through town and then out onto the highway, windows down, the summer air rushing around them. Neither spoke for a long time, content to share the moment and the freedom it represented. James finally pulled over at a scenic overlook. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. They sat on the hood of the car, watching the colors change. "I keep waiting to feel guilty," Lisa admitted, "but all I feel is relief and hope." James took her hand. What do you want to do now? With the divorce final, with my father leaving, we have choices to make. I've been thinking about that, Lisa said, turning to face him. I sold some jewelry your father gave me. Nothing sentimental, just expensive pieces I never really liked. It's enough for a fresh start somewhere new. A road trip? James asked, remembering their conversations about dreams of driving away. Lisa nodded. First, just for a few weeks, to see where the road takes us. Then, if things between us still feel right. They will, James interrupted, certain in a way he had never been before. Then we find a place where nobody knows us as stepmother and stepson, where we're just Lisa and James. James pulled her closer. What about college? I have 1 year left. There are colleges everywhere, Lisa said. Or you could take a year off. We have time to figure it out. The sun dipped below the horizon, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. James thought about the unlikely path that had brought them here, a summer that began with awkwardness and would end with a new beginning. The surprise in the garage, James said softly, looking at the Mustang. It turned out to be something completely different than what you planned. Lisa smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Sometimes the best surprises are the ones we never see coming. They sat together as night fell completely, making plans for their journey. Tomorrow they would pack the car and leave, following no particular route, seeking only the freedom to discover what they could become together. The restored Mustang, once meant as a gift for a marriage that wasn't meant to be, would carry them toward a future neither had imagined possible when summer began.